The year was 1791. The ink on the Constitution was barely dry. The United States was a fragile experiment. 13 states, stitched together by war, debt, and a shared dream of liberty. But for the farmers of western Pennsylvania, liberty was starting to feel like a distant promise. These were not radicals. They were veterans, men who had fought in the Continental Army, who had bled for independence. Now they were being taxed by the very government they helped to create, and they weren't going to take it quietly. Enter Alexander Hamilton, the brilliant and ambitious Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton believed in a strong central government, one that could raise revenue, pay off war debts, and assert authority over the states. In 1791, he proposed the first federal excise tax on a domestic product, distilled spirits. Why whiskey? Because it was everywhere. On the frontier, whiskey wasn't just a drink, it was currency. Farmers distilled surplus grain into whiskey because it was easier to transport and trade. In many rural communities, whiskey was used to pay wages, settle debts, and barter for goods. Hamilton's tax hit small producers hardest. Large distillers could afford the flat 6-cent per gallon tax, but small farmers had to pay 9 cents per gallon, and in cash. That was a problem. Cash was scarce on the frontier. Many farmers operated entirely on barter. To them, this wasn't just a tax, it was a betrayal. Resistance began almost immediately. In counties like Fayette, Allegheny, and Washington, farmers refused to register their stills or pay the tax. Excise officers were harassed, threatened, and in some cases, physically attacked. One of the most notorious incidents occurred in 1794 at Bower Hill, the home of tax collector John Neville. Neville was a Revolutionary War veteran and a staunch Federalist. He had been appointed as the Regional Inspector of Revenue, a position that made him a target. On July 15, 1794, a federal marshal named David Lennox arrived at Neville's home to serve writs to farmers who had refused to pay the tax. A group of armed men confronted them. Shots were fired. Lennox and Neville escaped, but tensions escalated. 2 days later, a force of nearly 500 armed rebels returned to Bower Hill. They demanded Neville's resignation. He refused. A firefight broke out. Neville's house was burned to the ground. 1 rebel was killed. The rebellion had turned violent. The Whiskey Rebellion was the first major test of federal authority under the new Constitution. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to, quote, lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, end quote. The whiskey tax was legally enacted, but enforcing it was another matter. In response to the violence, President George Washington invoked the Militia Acts of 1792. These laws authorized the president to call forth state militias, to suppress insurrections and enforce federal law. On August 7, 1794, Washington issued a proclamation ordering the rebels to disperse. When they refused, he took unprecedented action. He personally led a force of 13,000 troops into western Pennsylvania. It was the only time in American history that a sitting president led troops in the field. Washington's march was a show of strength, but it also revealed a deep ideological divide in the young republic. Federalists like Hamilton and Washington believed in centralized authority. They saw the rebellion as a threat to constitutional order, a dangerous echo of mob rule. Jeffersonian Republicans, on the other hand, sympathized with the rebels. They believed in states' rights, local control, and minimal federal interference. To them, the whiskey tax was an overreach, a policy crafted by coastal elites that punished rural Americans. Albert Gallatin, a Pennsylvania legislator and future Secretary of the Treasury under Jefferson, emerged as a key voice for the opposition. He argued that the tax was unfair and that the federal response was excessive. This divide would shape American politics for decades. To understand the full scope of the rebellion, it's important to unpack the key organizations and events involved. The excise tax of 1791 was the first federal tax on a domestic product. It applied to all distilled spirits, but disproportionately affected small producers in rural areas. The Militia Acts of 1792 gave the president authority to enforce federal law and suppress insurrections. They were the legal basis for Washington's military response. The attack on Bower Hill was the turning point of the rebellion. The violent confrontation between rebels and federal officials marked the shift from protest to insurrection. The president's decision to lead troops into Pennsylvania was a bold assertion of federal power. It sent a clear message. The Constitution would be enforced. When Washington's army arrived in western Pennsylvania, the rebellion quickly collapsed. Most rebels fled or submitted. There was no battle, no widespread arrests. Only 2 men were convicted of treason, Philip Vigil and John Mitchell. Both were sentenced to death, but Washington, seeking reconciliation, pardoned them. The rebellion was over, but its legacy had just begun. The Whiskey Rebellion is more than a historical footnote. It's a foundational moment in the American story, a moment that speaks directly to modern conservative values. The rebellion was a response to government intrusion into private enterprise. The whiskey tax punished small producers and favored large ones, a pattern that many conservatives see in modern regulatory policy. The rebellion highlighted the tension between federal authority and local autonomy. Today, that tension plays out in debates over education, health care, gun rights, and more. Washington's use of military force against citizens raises questions about the limits of presidential authority. Modern conservatives often warn against executive overreach, whether in the form of mandates, emergency powers, or federal enforcement. The rebels were working-class Americans standing up to elite power. Their story resonates with the MAGA movement's emphasis on forgotten Americans, economic freedom, and resistance to centralized control. The legal framework of the rebellion remains relevant today. Then, Congress had clear authority to levy taxes. The president could use militias to enforce federal law. And rebellion was treated as treason, but pardons were used to de-escalate. Now, the federal taxation power remains unchanged. The Posse Comitatus Act of 1878 limits the use of federal troops for domestic law enforcement. The Insurrection Act of 1807 still allows presidential use of military in extreme cases. Legal scholars continue to debate the scope of executive power, especially in times of crisis. These debates often align with conservative concerns about liberty, sovereignty, and constitutional limits. For those who want to dig deeper, here are some reliable sources: Britannica, Whiskey Rebellion; American History Central; History.com, Whiskey Rebellion; the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Militia Acts of 1792 at the Library of Congress, and the Posse Comitatus Act at Cornell Law School. In 1794, a group of American farmers stood up to a government they felt had betrayed them. They weren't anarchists. They weren't radicals. They were patriots. Their rebellion didn't succeed, but it forced the nation to confront a question we still ask today. How much power should Washington have over we the people? The Whiskey Rebellion reminds us that liberty is not a gift from government. It's a right defended by citizens.